Chapter 11. Rumor 3. The next day, I went to the university mage tower early in the morning. Open corner bracket blackened fire close corner bracket. I alternated between Alan's syllabus and the various magical books scattered on my desk as I sat on my office chair. I was still clueless about how I should go about teaching the elemental properties of magic, so I was trying to establish the direction that I should proceed in. This can explain the pure elements. Quote, one of the most difficult areas of magic for the wizards in the mage's tower was this, pure elements. If I would compare it to modern science, then this would be similar to explaining pure mathematics. And among the various topics in mathematics, only calculus had the advanced process that could pierce through the limits of the subject. And for pure elemental magic, the blackened fire close corner bracket boasted a difficulty that was bordering on heinousness. At least it was not at a level where debutantes could understand. It was unexpected, but it seemed like I could understand open corner bracket blackened fire close corner bracket easily. It was not an application but just something pure. In other words, open corner bracket understanding close corner bracket could work optimally in a straightforward process like delving deeper in just one field. Of course, comprehending the topic did not mean that I would be able to acquire it, but after I picked on open corner bracket blackened fire close corner bracket, every corner, I would use it as a textbook example so that they could understand pure elements easily. I think that's enough preparation for the class. Quote, after I finished writing the script, I covered my lecture organizer and called for Alan with the crystal ball. Alan, come over here. Quote, 5 seconds later, Alan opened the door as he stood in front of me. Yes, professor. Quote, Alan came quickly but he looked extremely exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes strangely resemble that of a panda's. Do you remember what I asked you the last time? Yes. It's here. Quote, Alan rummaged through the pockets in his robes and pulled out a brochure. It was an auction catalog. The snowflake obsidian is listed in Rowden auction houses list that will go on auction this Wednesday. Quote, I asked Alan to look for auctions where they auction off rare ores. Skimming through the catalog, I saw the mineral called snowflake obsidian at the bottom of the list. It was one of the top 10 minerals in this world. A setting that even someone like me knew. Above this, dragon bones, dragon horns were items that were above legendary and mythical. These were items that could not be bought even if one had money. So theoretically, snowflake obsidian was the best and strongest that you can get. Good job. Tell them that I will participate in the auction. Quote, yes. I understand. Quote, Alan bowed in understanding before going back. For your information, I have already checked the amount in my personal account. The account and card system was already invented in this world. 205,238,039 there is. The balance on my account was at least 200 million elms. This was more than enough. It was a personal account, so it wouldn't matter if I used everything inside. In the first place, the Eucline family had lived in such fraudulent lands, so their money was definitely very high. After all, they were people who would make a lot of money in sports even if their grades were very bad, since they have good connections. Come to think of it, Alan is just a graduate student. Quote, I felt a bit sorry for him once more. Alan was just a graduate student in an ordinary university, but the things that I had ordered him to do was something that was extremely personal. To make matters worse, the reason why Alan's dark circles were getting darker by the day was because all of the mages that shared the work with him quit last year. And because Deculane's personality was revealed, most of the wizards in the mage's tower never volunteered to work under him. If I compared it to modern times, then Alan was not only doing the work of all the graduate students, he was also doing the work for the professor's private affairs all by himself. If I compare it like that, then it's already serious. Quote, if things kept on going on like this, then I would either be stabbed to death or Alan would be overworked. I believed that I should be nicer to Alan in the future. Let's pick some people. That, professor. Quote, just as I was thinking about that, Alan came back inside as he handed an envelope to me. An official letter came from the Mage's Tower just now. Quote, right. Then you should get off work now and relax. Quote, yes. Yes. Quote, I ripped off the envelope which looked unnecessarily antique and looked at the official letter that was kept inside. A hearing will be held 6 months later to check and audit the progress of the research, the creation of pure elements and the 4 affiliated magic based on it, that is conducted by Senior Professor Diculaine. Please prepare the relevant data by then. Closing square bracket. Quote, this was the quarter where I could be wrenched out of my professor position if I made a mistake. This was quite an important event, but has Diculaine ever worked on magic before? If that was the case, then where was the research conducted and where were his findings? Research Institute. Diculaine's private laboratory was quite dirty. Of course it might be because I wasn't able to come here not long after I became Diculaine. But I don't think there's anything here. Quote, I searched the laboratory for anything at all. I even used my telekinesis from the ceiling down to the very corners of the room. I have already dug up most of the places in this room. All sorts of things, including a cloud of dust, flew everywhere, but no matter how hard I looked, nothing came out. I did not know if they burned it or if they had never done any research in the first place. I stopped using my telekinesis as I stood up and looked at the inside of the room. Houselessly large space, spider webs on the ceiling, our agent bottle with some sort of liquid decaying and rotting inside, appensulfats rolling around, and a mana extractor. If I could explain it in one word, mess. Everything was a mess. There were even golden bubbles puffed up from certain tiles on the laboratory's floor. That's it. I flipped the tile without even using my finger. The tile flipped upside down and there was a lump of feces covering the area like a lid. This was the perfect defense mechanism to prevent Diculaine from finding this. Of course, I also felt dizzy for a moment since his personality affected me too, but I easily got rid of the dirt with my telekinesis. At the bottom of the compartment, a briefcase filled with what I assume were old worn-out papers. The briefcase was buried under a mixture of fecal matter and dust. This was definitely not Diculaine's work. Perhaps, instead of Diculaine, it was those mages' work. I placed the briefcase down on the floor as I opened it up. Crumbling pieces of poop splashed everywhere. Quote, I felt dizzy for a moment, but I endured it to check the contents of the briefcase. And just as I expected, there were a bunch of documents inside the briefcase. I brought the papers to me using my telekinesis and held them in my hands. There was a subtle smell of poop wafting from the papers. I'm glad that I'm wearing gloves. Quote, a magic circle. Quote, approximately 70 pages of the documents were techniques. I knew that everything was about magic, but everything was encrypted. This won't work. Quote, I interpreted the magic circle using my open corner bracket understanding. As my mana got used up, every single line was revealed starting from the very first page. Just like that, the contents of the magical documents were released. I even had to close my eyes for a moment to adjust since a golden light suddenly shone brightly to the point that I almost got blinded. The light that came from the document filled the entire laboratory, and it seemed like the room was not enough to contain such blinding radiance. Quote, it seemed like the contents of the research were very great. Quote, however, it did not look like it was completed. There were tears on the pages, empty paragraphs, and completely incorrect logic. I gently held the documents, careful not to break them, when I suddenly saw an accessory at the corner of the briefcase in the corner of my eyes. It was a pendant. The pendant had a picture held within it. The picture was already faded with its corners all worn out. Quote, it was a picture of a father and a daughter. The father's face was broken and shattered, but the child was smiling brightly just like a normal naughty child. The child even innocently held their hand out in a V shape. Looking at the child closely, it seemed like I knew the face of this child. The child was still too naive, too cute and too young, but I was sure. Ifrin Luna. Perhaps this was the mage, Luna's enmity with Diculaine. Don't worry. Quote, Although my heart felt a bit bitter, I still muttered under my breath. My understanding would be able to organize, interpret, and assemble the scattered strands of your research. It would also be able to discover and calculate more insights into the things that you have not yet thought of. In the end, I would be able to develop this research topic more completely. If I'm able to complete the research that way, then I'll put your name in as co-author. Quote, "It was unfortunate, but I couldn't just post it under your care. I also need to keep my track record." I placed the documents and the pendant in my own briefcase before coming out. At the same time, wizard freshmen were chatting at a cafe, Light and Coffee, located in the university. "I think we should stick together." What I meant was to start a club. Quote, "Each and every one of them were all dressed in robes with a gourmet dessert and coffee in front of them, except for one. Ifrin was the only one drinking water. She just looked at the cake that entered the mouths of her classmates under the pretext of not liking any sweets or coffee. There are only 30 commoners and one should be the lead this time, right? If we don't stick together, then we might end up experiencing something unfair." Quote, these were the words of Julia, one of the wizards in the same year as them. She was an orange-haired bourgeois commoner. "Ifern, you're going to join, right?" Huh. Ifern, who was quietly sipping her water in a daze, was flustered by her sudden suggestion. "No. Ifern, you should definitely be there." Julia's coffee cup clattered down as she spoke. "You fought and stood up against Sylvia, right? I was extremely happy when I heard that rumor. You know what kind of person she is, right? She's totally a princess." Quote, Ifrin smiled bitterly. Ever since the big fight that day, rumors had been spreading like this, and Sylvia had become some kind of leader for the nobles while the leader for the commoners was herself. She was a decent aristocrat herself, but they omitted this fact themselves. "But we need to have a professor's permission if we want to do something like this. They would not like for us to get together like this." A shy, timid and cute man, Ferret, mumbled to himself. Julia also nodded her head as she pouted her lips. "That's true. That's our biggest problem." Quote, the club that they wanted to form was a club that was for commoners only. They liked the idea of fighting for their own rights, but getting permission from a professor would be hard. It was essential for them to create a club, but most of the professors were nobles. Of course, there were professors who were also commoners, but once they were appointed as professors, they would become honorary nobles and they would start to pose like real nobles. "How about Professor Leline?" Ferret's eyes widened. He looked like he agreed that it was a good idea, but Julia just shook her head. "Don't you know about the rumors about that fat professor? He's famous for being exceptionally nice to nobles. I also heard from our sunbays that he will not accept nor entertain commoners if they go to him for a complaint." Quote, really? I thought he was a good person though. Right, what kind of world are we living in these days? Quote, they discussed which professor would be a good choice. But it seemed like there weren't any big-shot noble professors that would help them in creating this commoners club. No, there were very few. Of course Professor de Culane is out of the question. Quote, a man named Rondo muttered quietly while Ifern's body trembled at the mention of his name. That's right, that professor. Julia's eyes suddenly widened in realization as her fingers flicked in the air. At least that professor ignores both commoners and aristocrats equally. Isn't that being fair? What the hell is fair about that? Ifern wanted to slowly get out of her seat, but she couldn't. The table was filled with coffee and desserts, so she had to eat at least one. In the first place, I got involved here because I want to get my spoils of war. They are Ekildrenif bourgeoisie, so I'm sure Thathiel just leave those behind. But if I don't eat this, then I'll have to starve today. Ifern, you should ask. Quote, then, there was a spark. Ifern, who was thinking about the cakes, bit her lips tightly as Julia continued to speak. Ifern, you heard the rumors, right? I heard that you did not get any disciplinary actions thanks to Professor de Culane. Quote, no. That professor, that person. It's just that things ended well for both of us. Quote, is that so? Then, my head hurts. Let's decide who we're going to ask later. Then, shall we go? Julia stood up as she swung the club creation plan in the air. I've been waiting for this very moment. Ifern smiled bitterly while shaking her head. Sorry. I don't have time, you guys go first. I'll treat you guys to a midnight snack tonight. Quote, Ifi, what did you say? Midnight snack. They don't have any senses, they'll probably order a lot of things. If that's the case, the midnight snack is more of a big deal than these cakes. In the first place, she wasn't that picky about the taste. All she needed to do was to fill her stomach. And if there were leftovers, then she could probably take it to the dorms. Quote, I'll only help with writing the plan. Quote, Ifern changed her words as she smacked her lips in anticipation. The group came out of the cafe and headed back to the tower. Julia kept on looking at the paper in her hands while she mumbled to herself. First off, if I made it off like it's not a club for commoners, then they'll definitely tag it as cheating. It's more complicated, huh? Julia, who was scratching her head, stiffened when she saw something. And it wasn't just Julia. Everyone stopped thinking about what they would eat for their late-night snacks. Well, except for Ifern, the rest of them stood still like trees trying to breathe. On the same road, far ahead of them, there was a person who stood out anywhere and anytime. He had such a perfect walk and he was more noble than any other nobles in the world. He was walking along the same path as them. Ifern, please. What? The midnight snack menu. Julia suddenly handed the plan over to Ifern. What the hell? Why are you suddenly giving this to me? Then, she pushed the bewildered Ifern on the back as hard as she could. Yeah, Ifern bounced off without knowing anything. And not long after, she stood in front of someone. The person was so tall that the only thing she could see for a moment was his chest. At that moment, wind blew around them and the scent of a clear and refreshing forest surrounded her. The clear and clean scent that wafted to her nose suddenly made her feel nervous. Ifern slowly raised her head. Gulp, she tried to swallow the lump in her throat. The sight that opened up in front of her was a perfect suit, with a noble tie and a badge made with pure gold that announced his title. Followed by a neat collar and a perfectly sleek jawline. And, finally, his face. Quote, Diculane. He was looking down at her. Ifern stared at him in a daze as he stared at her with a gaze that glowed coldly like a frozen jewel.